Notes on the English Character by E.M. Forster. I had better let the cat out of the bag at once and record my opinion that the character of the English is essentially middle class. There is sound historical reason for this, for since the end of the 18th century, the middle classes have been the dominant force in our community. They gained wealth by the Industrial Revolution, political power by the Reform Bill of 1832. They are connected with the rise and organization of the British Empire. They are responsible for the literature of the 19th century. Solidarity, caution, integrity, efficiency, a lack of imagination, hypocrisy. These qualities characterize the middle classes in every country, but in England they are national characteristics also, because only in England have the middle classes been in power for 150 years. Napoleon, in his rude way, called us a nation of shopkeepers. We prefer to call ourselves a great commercial nation. It sounds more dignified, but the two phrases amount to the same. Of course, there are other classes. There is an aristocracy. There are the poor. But it is on the middle classes that the eye of the critic rests, just as it rests on the poor in Russia and on the aristocracy in Japan. Russia is symbolized by the peasant or by the factory worker, Japan by the samurai. The national figure in England is Mr. Bull with his top hat, his comfortable clothes, his substantial stomach, and his substantial balance at the bank. St. George may caper on banners and in the speeches of politicians, but it is John Bull who delivers the goods. And even St. George, if Gibbon is correct, wore a top hat once. He was an army contractor and supplied indifferent bacon. It all amounts to the same in the end. Just as the heart of England is the middle classes, so the heart of the middle classes is the public school system. This extraordinary institution is local. It does not even exist all over the British Isles. It is unknown in Ireland, almost unknown in Scotland, countries excluded from my survey, and though it may inspire other great institutions, Alligar, for example, some of the schools in the United States, it remains unique because it was created by the Anglo-Saxon middle classes and can flourish only where they flourish. How perfectly it expresses their character. Far better, for instance, than does the university, into which social and spiritual complexities have already entered, with its boarding houses, its compulsory games, its system of prefects and fagging, its insistence on good form and on esprit de corps. It produces a type whose weight is out of all proportion to its numbers. On leaving school, a boy either sets to work at once, goes into the army or into business or emigrates, or else proceeds to the university and after 3 or 4 years there enters some other profession, becomes a barrister, doctor, civil servant, schoolmaster, or journalist, if through some mishap he does not become a manual worker or an artist. In all these careers, his education or the absence of it influences him. Its memories influence him also. Men look back on their school days as the happiest of their lives. They remember with regret that golden time when life, though hard, was not yet complex, when they all worked together and played together and thought together, so far as they thought at all, when they were taught that school is the world in miniature, and believe that no one can love his country who does not love his school. And they prolong that time as best they can by joining their old boys' society. Indeed, some of them remain old boys and nothing else for the rest of their lives. They attribute all good to the school. They worship it. They quote the remark that the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton. It is nothing to them that the remark is inapplicable historically and was never made by the Duke of Wellington, and that the Duke of Wellington was an Irishman. They go on quoting it because it expresses their sentiments. They feel that if the Duke of Wellington didn't make it, he ought to have, and if he wasn't an Englishman, he ought to have been. And they go forth into a world that is not entirely composed of public schoolmen or even of Anglo-Saxons, but of men who are as various as the sands of the sea, into a world of whose richness and subtlety they have no conception. They go forth into it with well-developed bodies, fairly developed minds, and undeveloped hearts. And it is this undeveloped heart that is largely responsible for the difficulties of the Englishman abroad. An undeveloped heart, not a cold one. The difference is important, and on it my next note will be based. For it is not that the Englishman can't feel, it is that he is afraid to feel. He has been taught at his public school that feeling is bad form. He must not express great joy or sorrow, or even open his mouth too wide when he talks. His pipe might fall out if he did. He must bottle up his emotions, or let them out only on very special occasion. Hypocrisy is the prime charge that is always brought against us. The Germans are called brutal, the Spanish cruel, the Americans superficial, and so on. But we are Perfide Albion, the island of hypocrites. The people who have built up an empire with a Bible in one hand, a pistol in the other, and financial concessions in both pockets. Is the charge true? I think it is. But what do we mean by hypocrisy? Do we mean conscious deceit? Well, the English are comparatively guiltless of this. They have little of the Renaissance villain about them. Do we mean unconscious deceit, muddle-headedness? Of this I believe them to be guilty. When an Englishman has been led into a course of wrong action, he has nearly always begun by muddling himself. A public school education does not make for mental clearness, and he possesses to a very high degree the power of confusing his own mind. How does it work in the domain of conduct? Jane Austen may seem an odd authority to cite, but Jane Austen has, within her limits, a marvellous insight into the English mind. Her range is limited. Her characters never attempt any of the more scarlet sins, but she has a merciful eye for questions of conduct, and the classical example of two English people muddling themselves before they embark upon a wrong course of action is to be found in the opening chapters of Sense and Sensibility. Old Mr. Dashwood has just died. He has been twice married. By his first marriage he has a son, John. By his second marriage, 3 daughters. The son is well off. The young ladies and their mother, for Mr. Dashwood's second wife survives him, are badly off. He has called his son to his deathbed, and has solemnly adjured him to provide for the second family. Much moved, the young man promises, and mentally decides to give each of his sisters £1,000. And then the comedy begins. For he announces his generous intention to his wife, and Mrs. John Dashwood by no means approves of depriving their own little boy of so large a sum. The £1,000 are accordingly reduced to 500, but even this seems rather much. Might not an annuity to the stepmother be less of a wrench? Yes, but though less of a wrench, it might be more of a drain, for she is very stout and healthy and scarcely 40. The occasional present of £50 will be better, and will, I think, be amply discharging my promise to my father. Or, better still, an occasional present of fish. And in the end, nothing is done. Nothing. The 4 impecunious ladies are not even helped in the moving of their furniture. Well, are the John Dashwoods hypocrites? It depends upon our definition of hypocrisy. The young man could not see his evil impulses as they gathered force and gained on him. And even his wife, though a worse character, is also self-deceived. She reflects that old Mr. Dashwood may have been out of his mind at his death. She thinks of her own little boy, and surely a mother ought to think of her own child. She has muddled herself so completely that in one sentence she can refuse the ladies the income that would enable them to keep a carriage, and in the next say that they will not be keeping a carriage, and so will have no expenses. No doubt men and women in other lands can muddle themselves too, yet the state of mind of Mr. and Mrs. John Dashwood seems to me typical of England. They are slow. They take time even to do wrong, whereas people in other lands do wrong quickly. There are national faults as there are national diseases, and perhaps one can draw a parallel between them. It has always impressed me that the national diseases of England should be cancer and consumption, slow, insidious, pretending to be something else, while the diseases proper to the south should be cholera and plague, which strike a man when he is perfectly well and may leave him a corpse by evening. Mr. and Mrs. John Dashwood are moral consumptives. They collapse gradually without realizing what the disease is. There is nothing dramatic or violent about their sin. You cannot call them villains.